Oh, hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 9 Man and Man. Tarzan of the Apes lived on in his wild jungle existence with little change for several years. Only that he grew stronger and wiser, and learned from his books more and more of the strange worlds which lay somewhere outside his primeval forest. To him, life was never monotonous or stale. There was always Pissa, the fish, to be caught in the many streams and the little lakes, and Sabor, with her ferocious cousins, to keep one ever on the alert and give zest to every instant that one spent upon the ground. Often they hunted him, and more often he hunted them, but though they never quite reached him with those cruel, sharp claws of theirs, yet there were times when one could scarce have passed a thick leaf between their talons and his smooth hide. Quick was Sabor, the lioness, and quick were Numa and Sheeta, but Tarzan of the Apes was lightning. With Tantor the elephant he made friends. How? Ask not, but this is known to the denizens of the jungle, that on many moonlight nights Tarzan of the Apes and Tantor the elephant walked together, and where the way was clear, Tarzan rode, perched high upon Tantor's mighty back. Many days during these years he spent in the cabin of his father, where still lay untouched the bones of his parents and the skeleton of Kala's baby. At 18 he read fluently and understood nearly all he read in the many and varied volumes on the shelves. Also could he write, with printed letters, rapidly and plainly, but script he had not mastered, for though there were several copybooks among his treasure, there was so little written English in the cabin that he saw no use for bothering with this other form of writing, though he could read it laboriously. Thus at 18 we find him, an English lording, who could speak no English, and yet who could read and write his native language. Never had he seen a human being other than himself, for the little area traversed by his tribe was watered by no greater river to bring down the savage natives of the interior. High hills shut it off on 3 sides, the ocean on the 4th. It was alive with lions and leopards and poisonous snakes. Its untouched mazes of matted jungle had as yet invited no hardy pioneer from the human beasts beyond its frontier. But as Tarzan of the Apes sat one day in the cabin of his father, delving into the mysteries of a new book, the ancient security of his jungle was broken forever. At the far eastern confine, a strange cavalcade strung. Cavalcade, a formal procession of people walking on horseback or riding in vehicles. Cavalcade, procession. At the far eastern confine, a strange cavalcade strung, in single file, over the brow of a low hill. In advance were 50 black warriors armed with slender wooden spears with ends hard baked over slow fires, and long bows and poisoned arrows. On their backs were oval shields. In their noses huge rings, while from the kinky wool of their heads protruded tufts of gay feathers. Across their foreheads were tattooed 3 parallel lines of color, and on each breast 3 concentric circles. Their yellow teeth were filed to sharp points, and their great protruding lips added still further to the low and bestial brutishness of their appearance. Following them were several hundred women and children, the former bearing upon their heads great burdens of cooking pots, household utensils, and ivory. In the rear were 100 warriors, similar in all respects to the advance guard. That they more greatly feared an attack from the rear than whatever unknown enemies lurked in their advance was evidenced by the formation of the column, and such was the fact, for they were fleeing from the white man's soldiers, who had so harassed them for rubber and ivory that they had turned upon their conquerors one day and massacred a white officer and a small detachment of his black troops. For many days they had gorged themselves on meat, but eventually a stronger body of troops had come and fallen upon their village by night to revenge the death of their comrades. That night the black soldiers of the white man had had meat aplenty, and this little remnant of a once powerful tribe had slunk off into the gloomy jungle toward the unknown and freedom. But that which meant freedom and the pursuit of happiness to these savage blacks meant consternation and death to many of the wild denizens of their new home. For 3 days the little cavalcade marched slowly through the heart of this unknown and untracked forest, until finally, early in the 4th day, they came upon a little spot near the banks of a small river, which seemed less thickly overgrown than any ground they had yet encountered. Here they set to work to build a new village, and in a month a great clearing had been made, huts and palisades erected, plantains, yams and maize planted, and they had taken up their old life in their new home. Here there were no white men, no soldiers, nor any rubber or ivory to be gathered for cruel and thankless taskmasters. Several moons passed by ere the blacks ventured far into the territory surrounding their new village. Several had already fallen prey to old Sabo, and because the jungle was so infested with these fierce and bloodthirsty cats, and with lions and leopards, the ebony warriors hesitated to trust themselves far from the safety of their palisades. But one day, Kulonga, a son of the old king, Mumbonga, wandered far into the dense mazes to the west. Warily he stepped, his slender lance ever ready, his long oval shield firmly grasped in his left hand close to his sleek ebony body. At his back his bow, and in the quiver upon his shield many slim straight arrows, well smeared with the thick dark tarry substance that rendered deadly their tiniest needle prick. Night found Kulonga far from the palisades of his father's village, but still headed westward, and climbing into the fork of a great tree, he fashioned a rude platform and curled himself for sleep. 3 miles to the west slept the tribe of Kerchak. Early the next morning, the apes were astir, moving through the jungle in search of food. Tarzan, as was his custom, prosecuted his search in the direction of the cabin, so that by leisurely hunting on the way, his stomach was filled by the time he reached the beach. The apes scattered by ones and twos and threes in all directions, but ever within a sound of a signal of alarm. Kala had moved slowly along an elephant track toward the east, and was busily engaged in turning over rotted limbs and logs in search of succulent bugs and fungi, when the faintest shadow of a strange noise brought her to startled attention. For 50 yards before her the trail was straight, and down this leafy tunnel she saw the stealthily advancing figure of a strange and fearful creature. It was Kulonga. Kala did not wait to see more, but turning, moved rapidly back along the trail. She did not run, but after the manner of her kind when not aroused, sought rather to avoid than to escape. Close after her came Kulonga. Here was meat. He could make a killing and feast well this day. On he hurried, his spear poised for the throw. At a turning of the trail, he came in sight of her again upon another straight stretch. His spear hand went far back, the muscles rolled. His spear hand went far back, the muscles rolled, lightning-like, beneath the sleek hide. Out shot the arm, and the spear sped toward Kala. A poor cast, but it grazed her side. With a cry of rage and pain, the she-ape turned upon her tormentor. In an instant the trees were crashing beneath the weight of her hurrying fellows, swinging rapidly toward the scene of trouble in answer to Kala's scream. As she charged, Kulonga unslung his bow and fitted an arrow with almost unthinkable quickness. Drawing the shaft far back, he drove the poisoned missile straight into the heart of the great anthropod. With a horrid scream, Kala plunged forward upon her face before the astonished members of her tribe. Roaring and shrieking, the apes dashed toward Kulonga. But that wary savage was fleeing down the trail like a frightened antelope. He knew something of the ferocity of these wild, hairy men, and his one desire was to put as many miles between himself and them as he possibly could. They followed him, racing through the trees for a long distance, but finally, one by one, they abandoned the chase and returned to the scene of the tragedy. None of them had ever seen a man before, other than Tarzan, and so they wondered vaguely what strange manner of creature it might be that had invaded their jungle. On the far beach by the little cabin, Tarzan heard the faint echoes of the conflict, and knowing that something was seriously amiss among the tribe, he hastened rapidly toward the direction of the sound. When he arrived, he found the entire tribe gathered, jabbering about the dead body of his slain mother. Tarzan's grief and anger were unbounded. He roared out his hideous challenge time and time again. He beat upon his great chest with his clenched fist, and then he fell upon the body of Kala and sobbed out the pitiful sorrowing of his lonely heart. To lose the only creature in all his world who ever had manifested love and affection for him was the greatest tragedy he had ever known. What though Kala was a fierce and hideous ape? To Tarzan she had been kind, she had been beautiful. Upon her he had lavished, unknown to himself, all the reverence and respect and love that a normal English boy feels for his own mother. He had never known another, and so to Kala was given, though mutely, all that would have belonged to the fair and lovely Lady Alice, had she lived. After the first outburst of grief, Tarzan controlled himself, and questioning the members of the tribe who had witnessed the killing of Kala, he learned all that their meager vocabulary could convey. It was enough, however, for his needs. It told him of a strange, hairless black ape with feathers growing upon its head, who launched death from a slender branch and then ran, with the fleetness of Bara the deer, toward the rising sun. Tarzan waited no longer, but leaping into the branches of the trees, sped rapidly through the forest. He knew the windings of the elephant trail along which Kala's murderer had flown, and so he cut straight through the jungle to intercept the black warrior, who was evidently following the tortuous detours of the trail. At his side was the hunting knife of his unknown sire, and across his shoulders the coils of his own long rope, and in an hour he struck the trail again, and coming to earth examined the soil minutely. In the soft mud on the bank of a tiny rivulet, he found footprints such as he alone in all the jungle had ever made, but much larger than his. His heart beat fast. Could it be that he was trailing a man, one of his own race? There were 2 sets of imprints pointing in opposite directions, so his quarry had already passed on his return along the trail. As he examined the newer spoor, a tiny particle of earth toppled from the outer edge of one of the footprints to the bottom of its shallow depression. Ah, the trail was very fresh. His prey must have but scarcely passed. Tarzan swung himself to the trees once more, and with swift noiselessness sped along high above the trail. He had covered barely a mile when he came upon the black warrior standing in a little open space. In his hand was a slender bow to which he had fitted one of his death-dealing arrows. Opposite him, across the little clearing, stood Horta the boar, with lowered head and foam-flecked tucks, ready to charge. Tarzan looked with wonder upon the strange creature beneath him, so like him in form, and yet so different in face and color. His books had portrayed the Negro, but how different had been the dull, dead print to this sleek thing of ebony pulsing with life. As the man stood there with drawn bow, Tarzan recognized him, not so much the Negro as the archer of his picture book. A stands for archer. How wonderful! Tarzan almost betrayed his presence in the deep excitement of his discovery. But things were commencing to happen below him. The sinewy black arm had drawn the shaft far back. Horta, the boar, was charging, and then the black released the little poisoned arrow, and Tarzan saw it fly with quickness of thought and lodged in the bristling neck of the boar. Scarcely had the shaft left his bow ere Kolunga had fitted another to it, but Horta the boar was upon him so quickly that he had no time to discharge it. With a bound, the black leaped entirely over the rushing beast, and turning with incredible swiftness, planted a second arrow in Horta's back. Then Kulonga sprang into a nearby tree. Horta wheeled to charge his enemy once more. A dozen steps he took, then he staggered and fell upon his side. For a moment his muscles stiffened and relaxed convulsively. Then he lay still. Kulonga came down from his tree. With a knife that hung at his side, he cut several large pieces from the boar's body. And in the center of the trail, he built a fire, cooking and eating as much as he wanted. The rest he left where it had fallen. Tarzan was an uninterested spectator. His desire to kill burned fiercely in his wild breast, but his desire to learn was even greater. He would follow this savage creature for a while and know from whence he came. He could kill him at his leisure later, when the bow and deadly arrows were laid aside. When Kolunga had finished his repast and disappeared beyond a near turning of the path, Tarzan dropped quietly to the ground. With his knife, he severed many strips of meat from Horta's carcass, but he did not cook them. He had seen fire, but only when Ara, the lightning, had destroyed some great tree, that any creature of the jungle could produce the red and yellow fangs which devoured wood and left nothing but fine dust, surprised Tarzan greatly. And why the black warrior had ruined his delicious repast by plunging it into the blighting heat was quite beyond him. Possibly Ara was a friend with whom the archer was sharing his food. But be that as it may, Tarzan would not ruin good meat in any such foolish manner. So he gobbled down a great quantity of the raw flesh, burying the balance of the carcass beside the trail where he could find it upon his return. And then Lord Greystoke wiped his greasy fingers upon his naked thighs and took up the trail of Kolunga, the son of Mumbonga, the king, while in far-off London another Lord Greystoke, the younger brother of the real Lord Greystoke's father, sent back his chops to the club's chef. Because they were underdone, and when he had finished his repast, he dipped his finger ends into a silver bowl of scented water and dried them upon a piece of snowy damask. All day Tarzan followed Kulonga, hovering above him in the trees like some malignant spirit. malign, evil in nature or effect, malevolent. All day Tarzan followed Kulonga, hovering above him in the trees like some malign spirit. Twice more he saw him hurl his arrows of destruction, once at Dango, the hyena, and again at Manu, the monkey. In each instance the animal died almost instantly, for Kulonga's poison was very fresh and very deadly. Tarzan thought much on this wondrous method of slaying, as he swung slowly along at a safe distance behind his quarry. He knew that alone the tiny prick of the arrow could not so quickly dispatch these wild things of the jungle, who were often torn and scratched and gored in a frightful manner as they fought with their jungle neighbors, yet as often recovered as not. No, there was something mysterious connected with these tiny silvers of wood, which could bring death by a mere scratch. He must look into the matter. That night Kulonga slept in the crotch of a mighty tree, and far above him crouched Tarzan of the Apes. When Kulonga awoke, he found that his bow and arrows had disappeared. The black warrior was furious and frightened, but more frightened than furious. He searched the ground below the tree, and he searched the tree above the ground, but there was no sign of either bow or arrows, or of the nocturnal marauder. Kulonga was panic-stricken. His spear he had hurled at Kala and had not recovered. And now that his bow and arrows were gone, he was defenseless except for a single knife. His only hope lay in reaching the village of Mumbonga as quickly as his legs would carry him. That he was not far from home he was certain, so he took the trail at a rapid trot. From a great mass of impenetrable foliage, a few yards away emerged Tarzan of the Apes to swing quietly in his wake. Kulonga's bow and arrows were securely tied high in the top of a giant tree, from which a patch of bark had been removed by a sharp knife near to the ground, and a branch half cut through and left hanging about 50 feet higher up. Thus Tarzan blazed the forest trails and marked his caches. As Kulonga continued his journey, Tarzan closed on him until he traveled almost over the black's head. His rope he now held coiled in his right hand. He was almost ready for the kill. The moment was delayed only because Tarzan was anxious to ascertain the black warrior's destination, and presently he was rewarded, for they came suddenly in view of a great clearing, at one end of which lay many strange layers. Tarzan was directly over Kulonga as he made the discovery. The forest ended abruptly, and beyond lay 200 yards of planted fields between the jungle and the village. Tarzan must act quickly or his prey would be gone. But Tarzan's life training left so little space between decision and action when an emergency confronted him that there was not even room for the shadow of a thought. Between. So it was that, as Kulonga emerged from the shadow of the jungle, a slender coil of rope sped sinuously above him from the lowest branch of a mighty tree directly upon the edge of the fields of Mumbonga. And ere the king's son had taken half a dozen steps into the clearing, a quick noose tightened about his neck. So quickly did Tarzan of the Apes drag back his prey that Kulonga's cry of alarm was throttled in his windpipe. Hand over hand, Tarzan drew the struggling black until he had him hanging by his neck in mid-air. Then Tarzan climbed to a larger branch, drawing the still, threshing victim well up into the sheltering verdure of the tree. Here he fastened the rope securely to a stout branch, and then descending, plunged his hunting knife into Kulonga's heart. Kala was avenged. Tarzan examined the black minutely, for he had never seen any other human being. The knife with its sheath and belt caught his eye. He appropriated them. A copper anklet also took his fancy, and this he transferred to his own leg. He examined and admired the tattooing on the forehead and breast. He marveled at the sharp-filed teeth and investigated and appropriated the feathered headdress. And then he prepared to get down to business, for Tarzan of the Apes was hungry, and here was meat of the kill, which jungle ethics permitted him to eat. How may we judge him? By what standards? This ape man with the heart and head and body of an English gentleman and the training of a wild beast. Tublat, whom he had hated and who he hated him. Tublat, whom he had hated and who had hated him, he had killed in a fair fight, and yet never had the thought of eating Tublat's flesh entered his head. It could have been as revolting to him as is cannibalism to us. But who was Kulanga, that he might not be eaten as fairly as Horta the boar or Bara the deer? Was he not simply another of the countless wild things of the jungle who preyed upon one another to satisfy the cravings of hunger? Suddenly, a strange doubt stayed his hand. Had not his books taught him that he was a man, and was not the archer a man also? Did men eat men? Alas, he did not know. Why, then, this hesitancy? Once more he essayed the effort, but a qualm of nausea overwhelmed him. He did not understand. All he knew was that he could not eat the flesh of this black man, and thus hereditary instinct, ages old, usurped the functions of his untaught mind and saved him from transgressing a worldwide law of whose very existence he was ignorant. Quickly he lowered Kulunga's body to the ground, removed the noose, and took to the trees again. Chapter 10. The Fear Phantom. From a lofty perch, Tarzan viewed the village of thatched huts across the intervening plantation. He saw that at one point the forest touched the village, and to this spot he made his way. Lured by a fever of curiosity to behold animals of his own kind, and to learn more of their ways, and view the strange layers in which they lived. His savage life among the fierce, wild brutes of the jungle left no opening for any thought that these could be aught else than enemies. Similarity of form led him into no erroneous conception of the welcome that would be accorded him should he be discovered by these, the first of his own kind he had ever seen. Tarzan of the Apes was no sentimentalist. He knew nothing of the brotherhood of man. All things outside his own tribe were his deadly enemies, with the few exceptions of which Tantor the elephant was a marked example. And he realized all this without malice or hatred. To kill was the law of the wild world he knew. Few were his primitive pleasures, but the greatest of these was to hunt and kill, and so he accorded to others the right to cherish the same desires as he, even though he himself might be the object of their hunt. His strange life had left him neither morose nor bloodthirsty. That he enjoyed in killing, and that he killed with a joyous laugh upon his handsome lips, betokened no innate cruelty. He killed for food most often, but being a man, he sometimes killed for pleasure, a thing which no other animal does, for it has remained for man alone among all creatures to kill senselessly and wantonly for the mere pleasure of inflicting suffering and death. And when he killed for revenge or in self-defense, he did that also without hysteria, for it was a very business-like proceeding which admitted of no levity. So it was that now, as he cautiously approached the village of Mumbonga, He was quite prepared either to kill or be killed should he be discovered. He proceeded with unwonted stealth, for Kulonga had taught him great respect for the little sharp splinters of wood which dealt death so swiftly and unerringly. At length he came to a great tree, heavy laden with thick foliage, and loaded with pendant loops of giant creepers. From this almost impenetrable bower above the village he crouched, looking down upon the scene below him, wondering over every feature of this new, strange life. There were naked children running and playing in the village street. There were women grinding dried plantain in crude stone mortars, while others were fashioning cakes from the powdered flour. Out in the fields he could see still other women hoeing, weeding, or gathering. All wore strange protruding girdles of dried grass about their hips, and many were loaded with brass and copper anklets, armlets and bracelets. Around many a dusky neck hung curiously coiled strands of wire, while several were further ornamented by huge nose rings. Tarzan of the Apes looked with growing wonder at these strange creatures. Dozing in the shade he saw several men, while at the extreme outskirts of the clearing he occasionally caught glimpses of armed warriors apparently guarding the village against surprise from an attacking enemy. He noticed that the women alone worked. Nowhere was there evidence of a man tilling the fields or performing any of the homely duties of the village. Finally, his eyes rested upon a woman directly beneath him. Before her was a small cauldron standing over a low fire, and in it bubbled a thick, reddish, tarry mass. On one side of her lay a quantity of wooden arrows, the points of which she dipped into the seething substance, then lay them upon a narrow rack of bows, which stood upon her other side. Tarzan of the Apes was fascinated. Here was the secret of the terrible destructiveness of the archer's tiny missiles. He noted the extreme care which the women took that none of the matter should touch her hands, and once, when a particle spattered upon one of her fingers, he saw her plunge the member into a vessel of water and quickly rub the tiny stain away with a handful of leaves. Tarzan knew nothing of poison, but his shrewd reasoning told him that it was this deadly stuff that killed, and not the little arrow, which was merely the messenger that carried it into the body of its victim. How he should like to have more of those little death-dealing slivers. If the woman would only leave her work for an instant, he could drop down, gather up a handful, and be back in the tree again before she drew 3 breaths. As he was trying to think out some plan to distract her attention, he heard a wild cry. From across the clearing. He looked and saw a black warrior standing beneath the very tree in which he had killed the murderer of Kala an hour before. The fellow was shouting and waving a spear above his head. Now and again he would point to something on the ground before him. The village was in an uproar instantly. Armed men rushed from the interior of many a hut and raced madly across the clearing toward the excited sentry. After them trooped the old men and the women and children until, in a moment, the village was deserted. Tarzan of the Apes knew that they had found the body of his victim, but that interested him far less than the fact that no one remained in the village to prevent his taking a supply of the arrows which lay below him. Quickly and noiselessly he dropped to the ground beside the cauldron of poison. For a moment he stood motionless, his quick, bright eyes scanning the interior of the palisade. No one was in sight. His eyes rested upon the open doorway of a nearby hut. He would take a look within, thought Tarzan, and so, cautiously, he approached the low thatched building. For a moment he stood without, listening intently. For a moment he stood without, listening intently. There was no sound, and he glided into the semi-darkness of the interior. Weapons hung against the walls, long spears, strangely shaped knives, a couple of narrow shields. In the center of the room was a cooking pot, and at the far end a litter of dry grasses covered by woven mats which evidently served the owners as beds and bedding. Several human skulls lay upon the floor. Tarzan of the Apes felt of each article, hefted the spears, smelled of them, for he saw, largely through his sensitive and highly trained nostrils. He determined to own one of these long pointed sticks. But he could not take one on this trip because of the arrows he meant to carry. As he took each article from the walls, he placed it in a pile in the center of the room. On top of all, he placed the cooking pot, inverted, and on top of this he had laid one of the grinning skulls, upon which he fastened the headdress of the dead Kulunga. Then he stood back, surveyed his work, and grinned. Tarzan of the Apes enjoyed a joke. But now he heard outside the sounds of many voices, the long mournful howls and mighty wailing. He was startled. Had he remained too long? Quickly he reached the doorway and peered down the village street toward the village gate. The natives were not yet in sight, though he could plainly hear them approaching across the plantation. They must be very near. Like a flash, he sprang across the opening into the pile of arrows, gathering up all he could carry under one arm. He overturned the seething cauldron with a kick and disappeared into the foliage above, just as the first of the returning natives entered the gate at the far end of the village street. Then he turned to watch the proceeding below, poised like some wild bird ready to take swift wing at the first sign of danger. The natives filled up the street, 4 of them bearing the dead body of Kulunga. Behind trailed the women, uttering strange cries and weird lamentation. On they came to the portals of Kulunga's hut, the very one in which Tarzan had wrought his depredations. Scarcely had half a dozen entered the building ere they came rushing out in wild, jabbering confusion. The others hastened to gather about. There was much excited gesticulation, pointing and chattering. Then several of the warriors approached and peered within. Finally, an old fellow with many ornaments of metal about his arms and legs, and a necklace of dried human hands depending upon his chest, entered the hut. It was Mumbunga, the king, father of Kulunga. For a few moments all was silent. Then Mumbunga emerged, a look of mingled wrath and superstitious fear writ among his hideous countenance. He spoke a few words to the assembled warriors, and in an instant the men were flying through the little village, searching minutely every hut and corner within the palisade. Scarcely had the search commenced than the overturned cauldron was discovered, and with it the theft of the poisoned arrows. Nothing more they found, and it was a thoroughly awed and frightened group of savages which huddled around their king a few moments later. Mumbunga could explain nothing of the strange events that had taken place. the finding of the still warm body of Kolunga on the very verge of their fields, and within easy earshot of the village, knifed and stripped at the door of his father's home, was in itself sufficiently mysterious. But these last awesome discoveries within the village, within the dead Kolunga's own hut, filled their hearts with dismay, and conjured in their poor brains only the most frightful of superstitious explanations. They stood in little groups, talking in low tones, and ever casting affrighted glances behind them from their great rolling eyes. Tarzan of the Apes watched them for a while from his lofty perch in the great tree. There was much in their demeanor which he could not understand, for of superstition he was ignorant, and of fear of any kind he had but a vague conception. The sun was high in the heavens. Tarzan had not broken fast this day, and it was many miles to where lay the toothsome remains of Horta the boar. So he turned his back upon the village of Mumbonga and melted away into the leafy fastness of the forest. Chapter 11. King of the Apes. It was not yet dark when he reached the tribe, though he stopped to exhume and devour the remains of the wild boar he had cached the preceding day. Cache, a collection of items of the same type stored in a hidden or inaccessible place. Cache, hoard, hiding place. It was not yet dark when he reached the tribe, though he stopped to exhume and devour the remains of the wild boar he had cached the preceding day, and again to take Kolunga's bow and arrows from the treetop in which he had hidden them. It was a well-laden Tarzan who dropped from the branches into the midst of the tribe of Kerchak. With swelling chest, he narrated the glories of his adventure and exhibited the spoils of conquest. Kerchak grunted and turned away, for he was jealous of this strange member of his band. In his little evil brain, he sought for some excuse to wreak his hatred upon Tarzan. The next day, Tarzan was practicing with his bow and arrows at the first gleam of dawn. At first, he lost nearly every bolt he shot, but finally he learned to guide the little shafts with fair accuracy, and ere a month had passed, he was no mean shot. But his proficiency had cost him nearly his entire supply of arrows. The tribe continued to find the hunting good in the vicinity of the beach, and so Tarzan of the Apes varied his archery practice with further investigation of his father's choice, though little store of books. It was during this period that the young English lord found, hidden in the back of one of the cupboards in the cabin, a small metal box. The key was in the lock, and a few moments of investigation and experimentation were rewarded with the successful opening of the receptacle. In it, he found a faded photograph of a smooth-faced young man, a golden locket studded with diamonds, linked to a small gold chain, a few letters, and a small book. Tarzan examined these all minutely. The photograph he liked most of all, for the eyes were smiling and the face was open and frank. It was his father. The locket, too, took his fancy, and he placed the chain about his neck in imitation of the ornamentation he had seen to be so common among the black men he had visited. The brilliant stones gleamed strangely against his smooth brown hide. The letters he could scarcely decipher, for he had learned little or nothing of script, So he put them back in the box with the photograph and turned his attention to the book. This was almost entirely filled with fine script, but while the little bugs were all familiar to him, their arrangement and the combinations in which they occurred were strange and entirely incomprehensible. Tarzan had long since learned the use of the dictionary, but much to his sorrow and perplexity, it proved of no avail to him in this emergency. Not a word of all that was writ in the book could he find, and so he put it back in the metal box, but with a determination to work out the mysteries of it later on. Little did he know that this book held between its covers the key to his origin, the answer to the strange riddle of his strange life. It was the diary of John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, kept in French, as had always been his custom. Tarzan replaced the box in the cupboard, but always thereafter he carried the features of the strong, smiling face of his father in his heart, and in his head a fixed determination to solve the mystery of the strange words in the little black book. At present, he had more important business in hand, for his supply of arrows was exhausted, and he must needs journey to the black men's village and renew it. Early the following morning he set out, and travelling rapidly, he came before midday to the clearing. Once more he took up his position in the great tree, and as before, he saw the women in the fields and the village street, and the cauldron of bubbling poison directly beneath him. For hours he lay awaiting his opportunity to drop down unseen and gather up the arrows for which he had come. But nothing now occurred to call the villagers away from their homes. The day wore on, and still Tarzan of the Apes crouched above the unsuspecting woman at the cauldron. Presently, the workers in the fields returned. The hunting warriors emerged from the forest, and when all were within the palisade, the gates were closed and barred. Many cooking pots were now in evidence about the village. Before each hut, a woman presided over a boiling stew, while little cakes of plantain and cassava puddings were to be seen on every hand. Suddenly, there came a hail from the edge of the clearing. Tarzan looked. It was a party of belated hunters returning from the north, and among them they half led, half carried a struggling animal. As they approached the village, the gates were thrown open to admit them, and then as the people saw the victim of the chase, a savage cry rose to the heavens, for the quarry was a man. As he was dragged, still resisting, into the village street, the women and children set upon him with sticks and stones, and Tarzan of the Apes, young and savage beast of the jungle, wondered at the cruel brutality of his own kind. Sheeta, the leopard, alone of all the jungle folk, tortured his prey. The ethics of all the others meted a quick and merciful death to their victims. Tarzan had learned from his books but scattered fragments of the ways of human beings. When he had followed Kulonga through the forest, he had expected to come to a city of strange houses on wheels. Puffing clouds of black smoke from a huge tree trunk in the roof of one of them, or to a sea covered with mighty floating buildings which he had learned were called variously ships and boats and steamers and craft. He had been sorely disappointed with the poor little village of the blacks, hidden away in his own jungle, and with not a single house as large as his own cabin upon the distant beach. He saw that these people were more wicked than his own apes, and as savage and cruel as Cerber herself. Tarzan began to hold his own kind in low esteem. Now they had tied their poor victim to a great post near the center of the village, directly before Mumbonga's hut, and here they formed a dancing, yelling circle of warriors about him, alive with flashing knives and menacing spears. In a larger circle squatted the women, yelling and beating upon drums. It reminded Tarzan of the dum-dum, and so he knew what to expect. He wondered if they would spring upon their meat while it was still alive. The apes did not do such things as that. The circle of warriors about the cringing captive drew closer and closer to their prey as they danced in wild and savage abandon to the maddening music of the drums. Presently, a spear reached out and pricked the victim. It was the signal for 50 others. Eyes, ears, arms, and legs were pierced. Every inch of the poor writhing body that did not cover a vital organ became the target of the cruel lancers. Women and children shrieked their delight. The warriors licked their hideous lips in anticipation of the feast to come, and vied with one another in the savagery and loathsomeness of the cruel indignities with which they tortured the still conscious prisoner. Then it was that Tarzan of the Apes saw his chance. All eyes were fixed upon the thrilling spectacle at stake. The light of day had given place to the darkness of moonless night, and only the fires in the immediate vicinity of the orgy had been kept alight to cast a restless glow upon the restless scene. Gently the lithe boy dropped to the soft earth at the end of the village street. Quickly he gathered up the arrows, all of them this time, for he had brought a number of long fibers to bind them into a bundle. Without haste, he wrapped them securely, and then, ere he turned to leave, the devil of capriciousness entered his heart. He looked about for some hint of a wild prank to play upon these strange, grotesque creatures, that they might be again aware of his presence among them. Dropping his bundle of arrows at the foot of the tree, Tarzan crept among the shadows at the side of the street, until he came to the same hut he had entered on the occasion of his first visit. Inside all was darkness, but his groping hand soon found the object of which he sought, and without further delay he turned again toward the door. But he had taken but a step, however, ere his quick ear caught the sound of approaching footsteps immediately without. In another instant the figure of a woman darkened the entrance of the hut. Tarzan drew back silently to the far wall, and his hand sought the long, keen hunting knife of his father. The woman came quickly to the center of the hut. There she paused for an instant, feeling about with her hands for the thing she sought. Evidently, it was not in its accustomed place, for she explored ever nearer and nearer the wall where Tarzan stood. So close was she now that the ape-man felt the animal warmth of her naked body. Up went the hunting knife, and then the woman turned to one side, and soon a guttural "ah" proclaimed that her search had at last been successful. Up went the hunting knife, and then the woman turned to one side, and soon a guttural "ah" proclaimed that her search had at last been successful. Immediately she turned and left the hut, and as she passed through the doorway, Tarzan saw that she carried a cooking pot in her hand. He followed closely after her, and as he reconnoitered, make a military observation of a region. Reconnoiter, survey. He followed closely after her, and as he reconnoitered, From the shadows of the doorway, he saw that all the women of the village were hastening to and from the various huts with pots and kettles. These they were filling with water and placing over a number of fires near the stake where the dying victim now hung, an inert and bloody mass of suffering. Choosing a moment where none seemed near, Tarzan hastened to his bundle of arrows beneath the great tree at the end of the village street. As on the former occasion, he overthrew the cauldron before leaping, sinuous and cat-like, into the lower branches of the forest giant. Silently, he climbed to a great height until he found a point where he could look through a leafy opening upon the scene beneath him. The women were now preparing the prisoner for their cooking pots, while the men stood about resting after the fatigue of their mad revel. Comparative quiet reigned in the village. Tarzan raised aloft the thing he had pilfered from the hut, and with aim made true by years of fruit and coconut throwing, launched it toward the group of savages. Squarely among them it fell, striking one of the warriors full upon the head and felling him to the ground. Then it rolled among the women and stopped beside the half-butchered thing they were preparing to feast upon. All gazed in consternation at it for an instant, and then with one accord broke and ran for their huts. It was a grinning human skull which looked up at them from the ground. The dropping of the thing out of the open sky was a miracle well aimed to work upon their superstitious fears. Thus, Tarzan of the Apes left them filled with terror at his new manifestation of the presence of some unseen and unearthly evil power which lurked in the forest about their village. Later, when they discovered the overturned cauldron and that once more their arrows had been pilfered, it commenced to dawn upon them that they had offended some great god by placing their village in this part of the jungle without propitiating him. Oh my gosh.
Propitiating
him. Propitiate. Win or regain the favor of a god, spirit, or person by doing something that pleases them. Propitiate. Appease. Later, when they discovered the overturned cauldron and that once more their arrows had been pilfered, it commenced to dawn upon them that they had offended some great god by placing their village in this part of the jungle without propitiating him. From then on, an offering of food was daily placed below the great tree from whence the arrows had disappeared, in an effort to conciliate the mighty one. But the seed of fear was deep sown, and had he but known it, Tarzan of the Apes had laid the foundation for much future misery for himself and his tribe. The night he slept in the forest, not far from the village, and early the next morning set out slowly on his homeward march, hunting as he traveled. Only a few berries and an occasional grubworm rewarded his search, and he was half famished when, looking up from a log he had been rooting beneath, he saw Sabor, the lioness, standing in the center of the trail not 20 paces from him. The great yellow eyes were fixed upon him with a wicked and baleful gleam, and the red tongue licked the longing lips as Sabor crouched, worming her stealthy way with belly flattened against the earth. Tarzan did not attempt to escape. He welcomed the opportunity for which, in fact, he had been searching for days past, now that he was armed with something more than a rope of grass. Quickly, he unslung his bow and fitted a well-daubed arrow, and as Sabor sprang, the tiny missile leaped to meet her in mid-air. At the same instant, Tarzan of the Apes jumped to one side, and as the great cat struck the ground beyond him, another death-tipped arrow sunk deep into Sabor's loin. With a mighty roar, the beast turned and charged once more, only to be met with a third arrow, thunk, full in one eye. But this time she was too close to the ape man for the latter to sidestep the onrushing body. Tarzan of the Apes went down beneath the great body of his enemy, but with gleaming knife drawn and striking home. For a moment they lay there, and then Tarzan realized that the inert mass lying upon him was beyond power ever again to injure man or ape. With difficulty he wriggled from beneath the great weight, and as he stood erect and gazed down upon the trophy of his skill, a mighty wave of exultation swept over him. With swelling breast, he placed a foot upon the body of his powerful enemy, and throwing back his fine young head, roared out the awful challenge of the victorious bull ape. I'm Tarzan. The forest echoed to the savage and triumphant paean.
Paean.
Paean, a song of praise or triumph. Paean. The forest echoed to the savage and triumphant paean. Birds fell still, and the larger animals and beasts of prey slunk stealthily away. For few there were of all the jungle who sought for trouble with the great anthropods. And in London, another Lord Greystoke was speaking to his kind in the House of Lords, but none trembled at the sound of his soft voice. Sabor proved unsavory eating even to Tarzan of the Apes, but hunger served as a most efficacious disguise.
Efficacious.
Efficacious, of something inanimate or abstract, successful in producing a desired or intended result. Effective, efficacious. But hunger served as a most efficacious disguise to toughness and rank taste, and ere long, with well-filled stomach, the ape-man was ready to sleep again. First, however, he must remove the hide, for it was as much for this as for any other purpose that he had desired to destroy Sabor. Deftly, he removed the great pelt, for he had practiced often on smaller animals. When the task was finished, he carried his trophy to the fork of a high tree, and there, curling himself securely in a crotch, he fell into deep and dreamless slumber. What with loss of sleep, arduous exercise, and a full belly, Tarzan of the Apes slept the sun around, awakening about noon of the following day, and straightway repaired to the carcass of Sabor, but was angered to find the bones picked clean by other hungry denizens of the jungle. Half an hour's leisurely progress through the forest brought to sight a young deer, and before the little creature knew that an enemy was near, a tiny arrow, thunk, had lodged in its neck. So quickly the virus worked that at the end of a dozen leaps the deer plunged headlong into the undergrowth, dead. Again did Tarzan feast well, but this time he did not sleep. Instead he hastened on toward the point where he had left the tribe, and when he had found them proudly exhibited the skin of Sabor the lioness. "Look," he cried, "apes of Kerchak! See what Tarzan, the mighty killer, has done. Who else among you has ever killed one of Numa's people? Tarzan is mightiest amongst you, for Tarzan is no ape. Tarzan is..." But here he stopped, for in the language of the anthropods there was no word for man, and Tarzan could only write the word in English. He could not pronounce it. The tribe had gathered about to look upon the proof of his wondrous prowess and to listen to his words. Only Kerchak hung back, nursing his hatred and his rage. Suddenly, something snapped, in the wicked little brain of the anthropod. What a frightful roar the great beast sprang among the assemblage. Biting and striking with his huge hands, he killed and maimed a dozen ere the balance could escape to the upper terraces of the forest. Frothing and shrieking in the insanity of his fury, Kerchak looked about for the object of his greatest hatred, and there, upon a nearby limb, he saw him sitting.
"Come down, Tarzan, great killer,"
cried Kerchak.
"Come down and feel the fangs of a greater. Do mighty fighters fly to the trees at the first approach of danger?"
And then Kerchak emitted the volleying challenge of his kind. Quietly, Tarzan dropped to the ground. Breathlessly, the tribe watched from their lofty perches as Kerchak, still roaring, charged the relatively puny figure. Nearly 7 feet stood Kerchak on his short legs. His enormous shoulders were bunched and rounded with huge muscles. The back of his short neck was as a single lump of iron sinew which bulged beyond the base of his skull, so that his head seemed like a small ball protruding from a huge mountain of flesh. His back-drawn, snarling lips exposed his great fighting fangs, and his little, wicked, blood-shot eyes gleamed in horrid reflections of his madness. Awaiting him stood Tarzan, himself a mighty muscled animal, but his 6 feet of height and his great rolling sinews seemed pitifully inadequate to the ordeal which awaited him. His bow and arrows lay some distance away, where he had dropped them while showing Sabor's hide to his fellow apes, so that he confronted Kerchak now with only his hunting knife and his superior intellect to offset the ferocious strength of his enemy. As his antagonist came roaring toward him, Lord Greystoke tore his long knife from its sheath, and with an answering challenge as horrid and blood-curdling as that of the beast he faced, rushed swiftly to meet the attack. He was too shrewd to allow those long, hairy arms to encircle him, and just as their bodies were about to crash together, Tarzan of the Apes grasped one of the huge wrists of his assailant, and springing lightly to one side, drove his knife to the hilt into Kerchak's body below the heart. Before he could wrench the blade free again, the bull's quick lunge to seize him in those awful arms had torn the weapon from Tarzan's grasp. Kerchak aimed a terrific blow at the ape-man's head with the flat of his hand, a blow which, had it landed, might easily have crushed in the side of Tarzan's skull. The man was too quick, and ducking beneath it himself delivered a mighty one, with clenched fist in the pit of Kerchak's stomach. The ape was staggered, and what with the mortal wound in his side had almost collapsed. When with one mighty effort he rallied for an instant, just long enough to enable him to wrest his arm free from Tarzan's grasp and close in a terrific clinch with his weary opponent. Straining the ape-man close to him, his great jaws sought Tarzan's throat, but the young lord's sinewy fingers were at Kerchak's own before the cruel fangs could close on the sleek brown skin. Thus they struggled, the one to crush out his opponent's life with those awful teeth, the other to close forever the windpipe beneath his strong grasp while he held the snarling mouth from him. The greater strength of the ape was slowly prevailing, and the teeth of the straining beast were scarce an inch from Tarzan's throat when a shuddering tremor with a shuddering tremor, the great body stiffened for an instant and then sank limply to the ground. Kerchak was dead. Withdrawing the knife that had so often rendered his that had so often rendered him master of far mightier muscles than his own, Tarzan of the Apes placed his foot upon the neck of his vanquished enemy, and once again, loud through the forest, rang the fierce, wild cry of the conqueror. I'm Tarzan. And thus came the young Lord Greystoke into the kingship of the apes. Chapter 12. Man's Reason. There was one of the tribe of Tarzan who questioned his authority, and that was Turcos, the son of Tublat. But he so feared the keen knife and the deadly arrows of his new lord that he confined the manifestation of his objections to petty disobediences and irritating mannerisms. Tarzan knew, however, that he but waited his opportunity to wrest the kingship from him by some sudden stroke of treachery, and so he was ever on his guard against surprise. For months, the life of the little band went on as it had before, except that Tarzan's greater intelligence and his ability as a hunter were the means of providing for them more bountiful than ever before. Most of them, therefore, were more than content with the change in rulers. Tarzan led them by night to the fields of the black men, and there, warned by their chief's superior wisdom, they ate only what they required, nor ever did they destroy what they could not eat, as is the way of Manu, the monkey, and of most apes. So while the blacks were wroth at the continued pilfering of their fields, they were not discouraged in their efforts to cultivate the land, as would have been the case had Tarzan permitted his people to lay waste the plantation wantonly. During this period, Tarzan paid many nocturnal visits to the village, where he often renewed his supply of arrows. He soon noticed the food always standing at the foot of the tree, which was his avenue into the palisade, and after a little he commenced to eat whatever the blacks put there. When the awe-struck savages saw that the food disappeared overnight, they were filled with consternation and dread, for it was one thing to put food out to propitiate a god or a devil, but quite another thing to have the spirit really come into the village and eat it. Such a thing was unheard of, and it clouded their superstitious minds with all manner of vague fears. Nor was this all. The periodic disappearance of their arrows and the strange pranks perpetrated by unseen hands had wrought them to such a state that life had become a veritable burden in their new home. And now it was that Mumbonga and his men and his head men began to talk of abandoning the village and seeking a site further on in the jungle. Presently, the black warriors began to strike further and further south into the heart of the forest, when they went to hunt, looking for a site for a new village. More often was the tribe of Tarzan disturbed by these wandering huntsmen. Now was the quiet, fierce solitude of the primeval forest broken by new strange cries. No longer was there safety for bird or beast. Man had come. Other animals passed up and down the jungle by day and by night, fierce, cruel beasts, but their weaker neighbors only fled from their immediate vicinity to return again when the danger was past. With man it is different. When he comes, many of the larger animals instinctively leave the district entirely, seldom if ever to return, and thus it has always been with the great anthropods. They flee man as man flees a pestilence. For a short time the tribe of Tarzan lingered in the vicinity of the beach, because their new chief hated the thought of leaving the treasured contents of the little cabin forever. But when one day a member of the tribe discovered the blacks in great numbers on the banks of a little stream that had been their watering place for generations, and in the act of clearing a space in the jungle and erecting many huts, the apes would remain no longer. And so Tarzan led them inland for many marches to a spot as yet undefiled by the foot of a human being. Once every moon Tarzan would go swinging rapidly back through the swaying branches to have a day with his books and to replenish his supply of arrows. This later task was becoming more and more difficult, for the blacks had taken to hiding their supply away at night in granaries and living huts. This necessitated watching by day on Tarzan's part to discover whether arrows were being concealed. Twice had he entered the huts at night while the inmates lay sleeping upon their mats, and stolen the arrows from the very sides of the warriors. But this method he realized to be too fraught with danger, and so he commenced picking up solitary hunters with his long deadly noose, stripping them of weapons and ornaments, and dropping their bodies from a high tree into the village street during the still watches of the night. These various escapades again so terrorized the blacks that, had it not been for the monthly respite between Tarzan's visits, in which they had opportunity to renew hope that each fresh incursion would prove the last, they soon would have abandoned their new village. The blacks had not as yet come upon Tarzan's cabin in the distant beach, but the ape-man lived in constant dread that, while he was away with the tribe, they would discover and despoil his treasure. So it came that he spent more and more time in the vicinity of his father's last home, and less with the tribe. Presently, the members of his little community began to suffer on account of his neglect, for disputes and quarrels constantly arose, which only the king might settle peaceably. At last, some of the older apes spoke to Tarzan on the subject, and for a month thereafter he remained constantly with the tribe. The duties of kingship among the anthropods are not many or arduous. In the afternoon comes Thaka, possibly to complain that old Mungo has stolen his new wife. Then must Tarzan summon all before him, and if he finds that the wife prefers her new lord, he commands that matters remain as they are, or possibly that Mungo give Thaka one of his daughters in exchange. Whatever his decision, the apes accept it as final, and return to their occupations satisfied. Then comes Tana, shrieking and holding tight her side from which blood is streaming. Gunto, her husband, has cruelly bitten her, and Gunto, summoned, says that Tana is lazy and will not bring him nuts and beetles or scratch his back for him. So Tarzan scolds them both and threatens Gunto with a taste of the death-bearing slivers. If he abuses Tana further, and Tana, for her part, is compelled to promise better attention to her wifely duties. And so it goes. Little family differences, for the most part, which, if left unsettled, would result finally in greater factional strife, and the eventual dismemberment of the tribe. But Tarzan, tired of it, as he found that kingship meant the curtailment of his liberty, he longed for the little cabin and the sun-kissed sea, for the cool interior of the well-built house, and for the never-ending wonders of the many books. As he had grown older, he found that he had grown away from his people, their interests, and his were far removed. They had not kept pace with him, nor could they understand aught of the many strange and wonderful dreams that passed through the active brain of their human king. So limited was their vocabulary that Tarzan could not even talk with them of the many new truths, and the great fields of thought that his reading had opened up before his longing eyes, or make known ambitions which stirred his soul. Among the tribe he no longer had friends as of old. A little child may find companionship in many strange and simple creatures, but to a grown man there must be some semblance of equality in intellect as the basis for agreeable association. Had Kala lived, Tarzan would have sacrificed all else to remain near her, but now that she was dead, and the playful friends of his childhood grown into fierce and surly brutes, he felt that he much preferred the peace and solitude of his cabin to the irksome duties of leadership amongst a horde of wild beasts. The hatred and jealousy of Terkoz, son of Tublat, did much to counteract the effect of Tarzan's desire to renounce his kingship among the apes, for, stubborn young Englishman that he was, he could not bring himself to retreat in the face of so malignant an enemy. That Terkoz would be chosen leader in his stead he knew full well, for time and again the ferocious brute had established his claim to physical supremacy over the few bull apes who had dared resent his savage bullying. Tarzan would have liked to subdue the ugly beast without recourse to knife or arrows. So much had his great strength and agility increased in the period following his maturity that he had come to believe that he might master the redoubtable Terkoz in a hand-to-hand fight were it not for the terrible advantage the anthropod's huge fighting fangs gave him over the poorly armed Tarzan. The entire matter was taken out of Tarzan's hands one day by force of circumstances, and his future left open to him, so that he might go or stay without any stain upon his savage excursion. Escutcheon.
Escutcheon.
Escutcheon, a shield or emblem bearing a coat of arms. Escutcheon, a flat piece of metal for protection and often ornamentation around a keyhole, door handle, so that he might go or stay without any stain upon his savage escutcheon. It happened thus. The tribe was feeding quietly, spread over a considerable area, when a great screaming arose some distance east of where Tarzan lay upon his belly beside a limpid brook, attempting to catch an elusive fish in his quick brown hands. With one accord, the tribe swung rapidly toward the frightened cries, and there found Terkoz holding an old female by the hair and beating her unmercifully with his great, big hands. As Tarzan approached, he raised his hand aloft for Terkoz to desist, for the female was not his, but belonged to a poor old ape whose fighting days were long over, and who, therefore, could not protect his family. Terkoz knew that it was against the laws of his kind to strike this woman of another, but being a bully, he had taken advantage of the weakness of the female's husband to chastise her because she had refused to give up to him a tender young rodent she had captured. When Terkoz saw Tarzan approaching without his arrows, he continued to belabor the poor woman in a studied effort to affront his hated chieftain. Tarzan did not repeat his warning signal, but instead rushed bodily upon the waiting Terkoz. Never had the ape-man fought so terrible a battle since that long-gone day when Bolgani, the great king gorilla, had so horribly manhandled him ere the new-found knife had, by accident, pricked the savage heart. Tarzan's knife on the present occasion Tarzan's knife on the present occasion but barely offset the gleaming fangs of Turquoise, and what little advantage the ape had over the man in brute strength was almost balanced by the latter's wonderful quickness and agility. In the sum total of their points, however, the anthropod had a shade the better of the battle, and had there been no other personal attribute to influence the final outcome, Tarzan of the Apes, the young Lord Greystoke, would have died as he had lived, an unknown savage beast in equatorial Africa. But there was that which had raised him far above his fellows of the jungle, that little spark which spells the whole vast difference between man and brute, reason. This it was which saved him from death beneath the iron muscles and tearing fangs of Turquoise. Scarcely had they fought a dozen seconds ere they were rolling upon the ground, striking, tearing, and rending, two great savage beasts battling to the death. Turquoise had a dozen knife wounds on head and breast, and Tarzan was torn and bleeding, his scalp in one place half torn from his head, so that a great piece hung down over one eye, obstructing his vision. But so far the young Englishman had been able to keep those horrible fangs from his jugular, and now as they fought less fiercely for a moment to regain their breath, Tarzan formed a cunning plan. He would work his way to the other's back and cling there with tooth and nail, drive his knife home until Turquoise was no more. The maneuver was accomplished more easily than he had hoped, for the stupid beast, not knowing what Tarzan was attempting, made no particular effort to prevent the accomplishment of the design. But when finally he realized that his antagonist was fastened to him, with his teeth and fists alike were useless against him, Turquoise hurled himself about upon the ground so violently that Tarzan could but cling desperately to the leaping, turning, twisting body, and ere he had struck a blow, the knife was hurled from his hand by a heavy impact against the earth, and Tarzan found himself defenseless. During the rollings and squirmings of the next few minutes, Tarzan's hold was loosened a dozen times until finally an accidental circumstance of those swift and over-changing evolutions gave him a new hold with his right hand, which he realized was absolutely unassailable. His arm was passed beneath Turquoise's arm from behind, and his hand and forearm encircled the back of Turquoise's neck. It was the half-Nelson of modern wrestling, which the untaught ape-man had stumbled upon, but superior reason showed him in an instant the value of the thing he had discovered. It was the difference to him between life and death. And so he struggled to encompass a similar hold with the left hand, and in a few moments Turquoise's bull neck was creaking beneath a full Nelson. There was no more lunging about now. The two lay perfectly still upon the ground, Tarzan upon Turquoise's back. Slowly, the bullet head of the ape was being forced lower and lower upon his chest. Tarzan knew what the result would be. In an instant the neck would break. Then there came to Turquoise's rescue the same thing that had put him in these sore straits, a man's reasoning power. If I kill him, thought Tarzan, what advantage will it be to me? Will it not rob the tribe of a great fighter? And if Turquoise be dead, he will know nothing of my supremacy. While alive, he will ever be an example to the other apes.
Kagoda!
Hissed Tarzan in Turquoise's ear, which in ape tongue means, freely translated, "Do you surrender?" For a moment there was no reply, and Tarzan added a few more ounces of pressure, which elicited a horrified shriek of pain from the great beast.
Kagoda!
repeated Tarzan.
Kagoda!
Cried Turquoise.
Listen,
said Tarzan, easing up a trifle, but not releasing his hold.
I am Tarzan, king of the apes, mighty hunter, mighty fighter. In all the jungle there is none so great. You have said Kagoda to me. All the tribe have heard. Quarrel no more with your king or your people, for next time I shall kill you. Do you understand?
Assented Turquoise.
And are you satisfied?
Said the ape. Tarzan let him up, and in a few minutes all were back at their vocations, as though naught had occurred to mar the tranquility of the primeval forest haunts. But deep in the minds of the apes was rooted the conviction that Tarzan was a mighty fighter and a strange creature. Strange because he had had it in his power to kill his enemy, but had allowed him to live unharmed. That afternoon, as the tribe came together, as was their wont before darkness settled on the jungle, Tarzan, his wounds washed in the waters of the stream, called the old males about him.
You have seen again today that Tarzan of the Apes is the greatest among you, he said.
They replied with one voice.
Tarzan is great.
Tarzan, he continued,
is not an ape. He is not like his people. His ways are not their ways. And so Tarzan is going back to the lair of his own kind by the waters of the great lake, which has no further source, which has no farther shore. You must choose another to rule you, for Tarzan will not return.
And thus young Lord Greystoke took the first step toward the goal which he had set, the finding of other white men like himself.